Hi, everyone. So I'm very excited to give you an overview today of our chess research workflow. So a lot of what I'm going to focus on today is giving kind of just a general overview of some CI needs that need to happen during the workflow, but especially during data collection as a preview for kind of the timing when certain types of information needs to come up. So for most experiments, the experiment doesn't begin at your beam time. It begins well before the beam time. First of all, the synchrotron experiment is often just one piece of a much larger project campaign that's happening. But even for just the synchrotron piece itself, you probably have planned your experiment well before you've ever put a proposal in. Hopefully you have some idea of how the beam time is going to go at that point. So it is also common then for your cyber infrastructure and computing needs to start before the beam time as well. So this is something to be aware of and to work with your staff scientists. That can be everything from remembering that all the data that you take at the synchrotron, you're going to want to keep as much metadata with that as possible. So it could be that you need to port a lot of information that's happening. For instance, like what material you have, you need to bring that to the beam time itself. You might need to be performing simulations, interacting with some of the different types of experimental workflows prior to your beam time in order to pick the best parameters for your beam time. And you also might need to start setting up some of your automated like experimental like data collection campaigns. So sometimes we'll ask you to like prescribe your experiment ahead of time. So it is important to understand that everything doesn't start at the beam time. However, right now, as a staff scientist, I can say that the beam time and data collection part of the research workflow is very overwhelming for users at the moment. And especially in terms of CI and computing. And so we're going to focus on this part of the research workflow. And a lot of this is because our users don't necessarily come in with that expertise. And there's a very high burden of needing to interact with many different computing features, many different parts of cyber infrastructure when you're actually at the Beamline. So it's good to be aware of this ahead of time. And we also acknowledge that we know that users have a very high burden of expertise. I've used this kind of slide in other programs in other contexts before, but users really need to become proficient, if not experts, in a few different categories to be really successful with synchrotron data specifically. So users are still always expected to understand their domain science, become experts in that. For often we have PhD students coming. We would like them to become experts in their X-ray science themselves. That's something that we at Chess, if you're at the users meeting yesterday, that's something that we really like to promote and help you on that journey. You also probably, as a user, need to understand and be an expert in other types of modalities. Maybe it's modeling, simulation, something complementary to your X-ray piece. But in order to use synchrotron data, especially in this day and age, you also need to be very strong with computing and cyber infrastructure. Our data is very large. It's on very complex systems. And historically, I will say, users have been on their own on this front. And in fact, I would, for staff scientists that are here, a lot of the training happens on the fly when when users get to the Beamline. And to be honest, we're not necessarily the right trainers to teach you in computing or cyber infrastructure. That's not necessarily our background. So one of the things we'd like to do through these programs is increase the awareness about what pieces are important to become literate in. So before your time of data collection, so that users can focus on science decisions at the Beamline instead of overwhelmingly trying to take on this skill set in real time, because synchrotron time is really precious. It's very expensive. And we're really excited to teach you about cyber infrastructure and computing, but it'd be great if we did it maybe in a different time period than just the data collection. And one thing I really need to emphasize is that I've seen a lot of users think that they're behind when it comes to this. And most users, absolutely regardless of their discipline that they were trained in, it doesn't matter if they're an engineer, biology, chemistry, they do not come with sufficiently strong background in scientific computing or cyber infrastructure to perform their synchrotron analysis when it's their first beam time. Hopefully they've picked up the skills by the time it's their second beam time, but most people don't come with the skill set. So that's if you didn't come with this skill set, that's normal, and that's why we have these programs. There are very diverse science beamlines and cases at Chess. We have 7 beamlines. You heard yesterday about 2 more that are coming online, the HMF beamline and the XLEAP beamline. We also have many different sub-facilities. And so all these different science drivers and communities, while we do share a lot of the same pieces at Chess, we also have very different diverse needs in computing and infrastructure. So I'm going to give an overview today, but one thing I need to emphasize is that your specific journey and how you're going to interact with different code bases or even the Chess infrastructure may be very different than one beamline over. It could even be different within a beamline depending on the technique. So it is important to always be in communication with your beamline scientist to understand, okay, what are the needs for this particular technique? This is just a flavor of some of the programs, but today I'm going to go a little bit through some things that are true of all the different programs. Then there are different skill sets that most people would benefit from, like most of the beamlines use some form of Python coding. A lot of the beamlines use spec. And then using Git or certain types of version control is going to be really an important practice. And then, of course, there'll be program and technique-specific types of cases. And some of these trainings are still under development, so but some of them are deployed, and you'll find them on the Xsite website already. So when we talk about going and doing data collection, I'm going to kind of move around this schematic today, but one of the important pieces is the station computer. So the station computer is your central command control place. It communicates to all the hardware and the software needed for data collection. Your station computer typically is running tons of different processes at once, and it's responsible for orchestrating your data collection, your motor motions, synchronizing your triggers, logging your metadata, et cetera. So it's a really important place to be. You will be directly, as users, most beamlines, you're directly sitting on the station computer. You're either no machining in or you're actually interacting with that computer itself. And this station computer has really special permissions because it's allowed to talk to all those different pieces and things. And so it allows it to communicate with protected devices and file systems that no other computer can talk to. So that's great for data collection because no one else can interrupt you. But that also means you have to already have an understanding that you have to be a really good steward of these tools before you come to the Beamline, and especially at the Beamline. It's really important to only interact with processes that your staff scientist has approved or trained you on. And something that you may not be aware of if you're not used to Linux systems or compute farms is that some of the processes that are going to be happening on your station computer are actually going to be launched from, they're going to be a different computer is going to be running that process, and it's only rendering the view on that station computer. And this is really important because if you then go to open, for instance, that GUI locally, one of the things that can happen is you can overwhelm the memory of your station computer and your whole control system can shut down. We've maybe experienced this before. So it is important to understand how different things are working there and to work with your scientist to understand all the different pieces. I'll show a couple of examples of what this looks like. And then I just threw this slide in, but importantly, the station computer, these run on Linux. Not all people are familiar with Linux OSs, so there is a Linux training module that is up right now. And then also it is important for users to understand they are going to be interacting at times with terminal and using the command line interface to be launching different programs. And so for many, this is a little overwhelming at first if your Beamtime is the first time you've ever seen this, but if it's not the first time you've ever seen it, I think you might find you actually enjoy it better than GUIs at times. For most of our station computers, we have different software acquisition. So spec is the common software controls language that we have. We're building out a training module on this. So this image didn't render very well for you, but normally it would be rendered nicely. It looks like a terminal window. It's launching a program called spec. And spec is a language based on C, and it's used for instrument control and data acquisition at many different synchrotrons. When using spec, you're going to interact with the terminal and you'll use a combination of standard spec commands. So there are some spec commands that are common to all the different Beamlines. And then there'll also be programs that are compiled for you that are unique to your Beamline and that you're asked to execute for your technique. The other common set of software that you'll see that we use Epics a lot. So Epics is a set of software tools and applications that give us a software infrastructure for use in building control systems to operate different devices. So most of our devices at Chess, we do, when possible, try to leverage Epics. So we'll use Epics drivers to run things like our detectors. So this is like a little corner view of a GUI that runs all the different process variables and some of the interaction points for being able to operate the detector and tell the detector what state it should be in and how to run. And then also we commonly will use signals piped in. So I call them Epics PVs here. Those are process variables. Those are different types of signals that can be logged in many of our different metadata services. You can also bring in your own device, have it set up as an Epics PV, use it for metadata logging, et cetera. So just so you're aware of Epics exists. This is a actually kind of tidy version of a station computer. I cleaned up some things, but station computers tend to have many different windows on them. This is just giving a little flavor. So some stations have 4 different screens on them. Some have 2. A lot of them have different desktops. So if you actually, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I'm actually only on desktop 1 here. As I click through, usually this will be populated as the beam goes on with lots of different pieces. So over here on my left, I have a spec terminal. It gives you an idea of what that looks like. I have a pan tilt zoom camera that's looking at the samples inside the Beamline. You can see all these little displays that are popped up here. These are Epics-based MEDM, or their motif editor and display manager control panel. So this is very common to see at the Beamline. These can be both custom, and then there'll also be pieces that are common across some Beamlines. Here I have one of those controllers for our detector. We have a GUI, and then this is our station-specific software called HexRD, looking at one of our images that's come up. There also could be lab views, other types of signals, other pieces that you're going to be asked to interact with, but just so you know, it will get very cluttered in there. This can be overwhelming. I have an example of hopefully this renders. Advanced. Skip. The IT director told me to skip. Okay. So here you can see I'm interacting with my spec window. I'm giving it a series of commands. First, I'm just asking where different motors are. You can type in other types of standard pieces. I'm trying to do a fly scan for many of our commands. If you type in the command, you click enter, it will tell you what you need to put in. So then I'm running a scan. You can see that the sample is starting to rotate. So this is just giving you a flavor that, I'm just using the spec window. I'm asking motors to move. It's sending triggers. It's taking data. And then when it's done, it'll return me back that prompt. And then there's also, at the very end of this, I'm going to run a custom macro that just has me put in and out of foil. And you're going to see the little dot in the left corner is going to turn green. Well, actually, first, I guess I'm going to tweak this left and right. And I talked faster than I typed here, which is good. So you can just see we're moving around some motors and then some custom macros. This one's kind of simple, but I put the foil in and you can see that little gold turns to green. So I actually slipped a little foil in at the Beamline. It sent a trigger saying it's in, and then I asked it to be removed, and then that little dot went out. So you can see just a little bit of typing, moving. That's a lot of how we do stuff here. How do I get back? Oh, sorry to those online if you didn't get to see that because I was not sharing that piece. So you can go see it later. Okay. So your station computer, in addition to being connected with many different types of hardware triggers, so we'll be sending analog and digital signals. Some of those analog signals will also be converted into digital signals so that you can keep track of them. But importantly, there's also going to be a lot of networking with Ethernet cables sending data back and forth different places. Data is traveling rapidly between devices, computers, storage locations. There's all different natures to how these different connections are happening. So there's Ethernet and fiber connections. The one I want to really draw attention to in this meeting is that there are specialized fast pathways that allow you to move data between equipment. And some of these pathways are protected and or isolated so that you can have the fastest data pathways without interruption or bandwidth issues. The only approved instruments and devices can be connected to these networks. I'll talk a little bit about if you want to bring your own stuff to the Beamline in a minute, but things are very helpfully color-coded too. So the Chess DAC network in the Beamlines are orange. The station isolated networks are pink. So pink, it means that it's basically only talking within the station and everything there is just connected internally. And the Chess DAC goes to one of our bigger file systems into the raw system or the write-only raw system of the Chess place. So in the Chess file system. We also have different Wi-Fi that you can access while you're at Chess. This can sometimes be confusing. The preference is to use eGROAM, but there's also something called LNS protected, which allows you to be able to look at the DAC. Your device does need to be registered ahead of time if you want to bring your own device to be able to look at the DAC. So Chess has many file systems, and this is very important to know when you come to the Beamline because you're going to be asked to put your data in certain places or save certain types of data in others. So there's, of course, the DAC or raw data. So this is backed up nightly. This is a place for data that is not able to be replicated. So like anything that's your raw data coming off of your detectors, any signals that are generated that it's not possible for you to reproduce during the beam time, that should go in your DAC raw. And it's only writable by the station computers. So you, as your class ID, will not be able to write directly to raw. And that's for good reason, because we just want the raw data there. And it will be read-only to you and only writable by the station computer. So others can't go in and delete your data. The metadata is a very important folder. This also gets nightly incremental backups, and this is where you'll want to keep things like your beam time notes or anything that you're generating at the beam time that absolutely can never be replicated. So if you're taking some beam time notes that you don't want to be ephemeral or you don't think you can reproduce it, it should be going in the metadata folder. There's a reduced data section. This is not backed up nightly, but it is a very large section for reducing your data. The idea behind reduced data is that it does get backed up, but it's not backed up nightly. So it is a good place to be doing data reduction where you conceivably, although it would be very painful, you could reproduce what you have done in the reduced data area. And you might ask, well, why can't I just back up everything nightly? And the answer is when we were doing that, it slowed down all the networks and all of the data collection at that time because these are huge amounts of data. So we actually only want to be backing up data that actually needs to be backed up nightly. So the new things that come onto raw and then things that don't need to be backed up nightly, we don't want to do that because we want to save all the bandwidth that we have for doing this fast data collection and gathering the highest quality data that we can, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Then there's the user space. If it's not associated with the beam time, user space is a great thing to use. It's very similar to reduced data. It is backed up nightly though. So it is best practice to use reduced or scratch. And scratch is a wonderful place if you are testing out some code and you don't know if the result is going to be good. Scratch is where you want to be doing it because scratch is not backed up. So it's for temporary files. And then once you're really satisfied with, you've got the whole infrastructure of what you're trying to run and it's going well, then you should move over to reduced data. And in the training that's actually in the Markdown, it explains all the things I just said to you in words of recommended use of these files. But your Beamline scientists should kind of let you know where they think your particular data set or your workflows should go within this file system scheme. But it's important to know that each data tier actually has a very different use case and actually has different backup policies and different sizes. Okay, so we also can handle protected data. We can do both IP and export control work. Some data needs to be protected in this way. I have to emphasize all data must be declared and all agreements signed before any data collection ever happens at the Beam. Because everything needs to be agreed upon with the lawyers and other pieces. But this is just to say that all data collection, storage, and analysis can be customized to comply with these types of data agreements. So if there needs to be encrypted drives, modifying certain isolated networks or encrypted computers, this is all possible to do at Chess and is done frequently. We do have Beamlines that work on ITAR. So there's a bring your own device policy that we have. So users may need to bring their own device. We may even encourage you to bring your own device in certain cases. This can be either physically in the lab or remotely. It needs to be connected to certain Chess networks. Examples of this include having a controls computer for equipment that you've brought yourself, an analysis computer for on-the-fly analysis that maybe has some like specialized programs on it. It can also include if you bring, for instance, a camera and you need the software to operate that or the drivers to operate that camera, we might need extra time to make sure that that can go on one of our computers. So you need to work with Chess IT at least 2 weeks ahead of time to make sure that your equipment can be integrated. If you try to get approved after 2 weeks, it just may not be possible for you to bring it to the Beamline. And I just need to really emphasize that because at times IT has been great and they've been able to heroically get things working, but you shouldn't depend on that because it may actually not be possible to do it in such a short time period. If you're bringing a computer that needs to read from the DAC network, it just needs to be registered and added to the LNS protected network. And there's instructions for that on the class wiki. So we produce really large data volumes. And so there's a couple of different options for what to do when your data is so big. So first of all, if your data is big but small enough to transfer to your institution, either your institution has some really beefy resources that it can leverage or is on one of our fast network connections across the country. Our preferred method that we suggest is using Globus, which there's some really great instructions on the class wiki for. But there is a reality that the data may be too large to easily transfer to your home institution, or there's not enough requisite compute sources at that institution. So you do have the option of leaving it at Chess and using our compute resources. There's this concept of hot and cold data storage that I think is really important for all users to understand. So when data is initially written to the raw drive, it's available for direct access for data transfer or analysis. So it's considered in hot storage. So when you go to interact with it on our compute farm, you'll see that there's like a very fast response time. It's sitting on networks that have 10 gigabit lines or 1 gigabit lines like throughout the lab. We can't keep all of our data in hot storage for very long periods of time because we're collecting data too rapidly. The volumes are too large. So a lot of this data will be moved to cold storage, or in our case, being rolled over to tape where it will not be accessible on the network anymore after approximately 6 months. And that can vary depending on the Beamline. The data will always be saved right now. We save all the raw data. It's just, it might be that it won't be accessible anymore when it's rolled onto cold tape. You can always have it arranged to be rolled back into hot storage, but we really encourage people to interact with their data, try to get their data analysis done as quickly as possible, or at least their data compressed as quickly as possible so that it takes up a much smaller space. The raw drive is typically what is actually moved into cold storage. So if you can get your data reduced into the reduced data folder and it's not too egregiously large, usually IT will let you leave it there for quite a bit of time. And yeah, until your postdoc, Sven called me out. I had a lot of data on the reduced and user drive that I had to clear out. So if you get if you get asked to move things, know that you're not the only one. I also get asked to move things off. So there is the ability to do real-time visualizing, and we really encourage users to look at your data as it's coming out, make sure it is the quality that you want to use. There's going to be a lot of different options for this at different Beamlines. There's different GUIs. different ways of checking these signals. And one of the newer ways of doing this, at a couple of Beamlines, we've started deploying a dashboard for interactive viewing of the large data sets that are happening. So the National Data Science Data Fabric dashboard, which Valerio gave a preview of yesterday. This is deployed at 3A and 4B. We're hoping to deploy that across more Beamlines. There'll be a demo of that later today, and that's built on a platform called OpenVisus to enable real-time visualization. It may not be obvious, but your data is so large that you may not be able to view it in conventional ways, especially if you have some of these large 2D area detectors that you're viewing. So you may need to adapt other types of strategies or really understand that you will have to learn how to use other programs in order to view the data. And then in order to combat how large the data is, many Beamlines will have an initial data reduction procedure where your data won't be in its full formatted size. So this can happen either through a post-processing software step that often is deployed on the compute farms, or it can happen increasingly inline at an analysis computer that might be sitting right at the end of your detector data collection. So it's important to understand what's actually happening at your Beamline. So I'm also just letting you know there's a diversity of many different things that are happening. So very importantly, I need to mention some things about capturing metadata. So ideally, you need to capture all the data necessary to fully reproduce your results. They need to be recorded and disseminated in a manner that others could interpret, not just people within your group. And ideally, you would have an unbroken provenance from experimental planning. This is very difficult to do in practice. Werner talked a little bit about some programs that we have upcoming called Foxden that are really going to help automate some of this process. But in the meantime, one of the resources that we have is that we are deploying something called this metadata service, and it provides a tool to record and automatically ingest machine readable metadata in a systematic way that you can tag along with your sample data. This allows you to include variables that historically have not been recorded via a second data stream, such as my material. This is data about my materials processing parameter. This is the actual elements that are inside the material that I'm looking at. These are the people who are sitting at the Beamline with me today. Those are some really important metadata pieces that can be captured here that haven't historically been recorded. There are also, other than being able to fill out these types of metadata pieces, there are going to be so many parallel metadata streams, or even you might even just consider them data streams that are going to be happening at Chess. And so there will be many different ways to access that. And a lot of times your Beamline's the technique will have already integrated some of the essential pieces with your scans. So for instance, the incoming flux of the beam, how many photons are coming into your hutch, so you can normalize against that number with the data that you have. Okay, I have very strong opinions on this. That's why it's such a dense slide. But basically, it's really important to take high quality experiment beam time notes. Ultimately, some of the most important metadata comes from your experimental logbook. We cannot have thought of everything to be able to capture automatically with the data collection. Your beam time notes need to supplement that metadata during data collection so that your experiment can be entirely reproduced. Ideally, that should be your goal. It's important to record decisions that were made, scientifically, why did you choose to do this versus that? Those are the types of things that really are not captured just from the hard data itself, but that's what makes what are the decisions that scientists made at the beam time? And really importantly, your Beamline scientist sees tons of experiments coming through. They're not going to remember every detail of your beam time, although some scientists are really good at this, and we're very fortunate. But it's not their responsibility to be taking your beam time notes. That's the user's responsibility with their experiment. One thing I didn't mention in here, but it is important, my colleague Kate mentioned it yesterday to me, is that really leverage collaborative Beamtime notes. A lot of these data are being collected on a team. It doesn't make a lot of sense to take 10 different individual lab notebooks that are all a little bit different. Like really leverage using a central resource so that you can all go back to that collectively and make sure that all the information was captured. For recording notes during the beam time, we strongly recommend using plain text or markdown language if you want to include figures or some formatting with your notes. It's easy to read in many different systems. One challenge if you go to using Microsoft Word is that you can't just view it from the command line. You have to, it's a proprietary format. It's difficult to keep the formatting everywhere. Just as I mentioned, like you can render images in Markdown. Markdown is going to be something that we can provide a module for your training here at Excite too. You should always save a copy of your Beamtime notes or link your Google Doc or equivalent or wherever you're keeping them on the chess file system with the data. Your Beamline scientist will tell you the best place at your specific Beamline to do that. And then for software, you need to comment any code produced at the Beamline. But if the code was used to make decisions about the experiment, it should be saved and referred to in your experiment log. This is all a part of the metadata. It's all a part of your experiment in your experiment notes. And a friendly reminder is please no spaces in file names. Use underscores or camel case or make a decision. And files should start with a letter, not a number. Some programs get kind of upset if you start with a number. Jupyter Hub is something we're going to interact with today. Before getting into that, a lot of the software that you're interacting with is going to be domain and technique specific, but a lot of it will leverage Python or some common languages across the lab. And Chess has many common X-ray software packages on the system. I'll have a little nod to that in the next slide. But for software development, for at Beamtime code development, we strongly recommend using our Jupyter Hub. There's links to this. There'll be instructions later today on how to do this. And here's a little image of it. It is really easy to deploy. It's already set up to look at our file systems. It's really a great resource. Or if you are going to use a different IDE or that's an integrated development environment at your Beamline, we do have instances of Visual Studio Code, Spider, MATLAB, et cetera, depending on what you're using. There are going to be so many data analysis specific software packages. It completely depends on the technique that you're using. Here's just a really like tiny flavor of ones that we support here. But my important point at the bottom is if you are super familiar with one of these software packages and you want to create a tutorial for an Excite link, we're really interested in other people doing that. So let us know. Go ahead and check out the Excite website, kind of see how that's structured, and then see if you want to give a mini intro. I'm getting to the end of this, don't worry, but the class compute farm. So we do have a compute farm. I'm not getting into details about it here, but there's really great instructions on the wiki page for this. So the concept of a compute farm is we're going to have many different computers that are distributed resources that are all connected to a central place where you can basically take any of your code and you can either submit a job to be performed on one of those compute farms and it will write out your data, and then you'll go find it in a spot, and this will instruct you how, or with a combination of also your Beamline scientists currently can instruct you in how to submit those different types of jobs, or you can interactively grab one of the computers off of the compute farm and start to interact with it, same as you do the other Linux systems. These compute farms can be the computers on the compute farm can be very powerful. And there's a list also on the class wiki of like the different types of computers and resources and how to make sure you get onto a resource that actually is powerful enough for what you need to run or isn't more powerful than you need to run. A quick other piece is the chess analysis pipeline. Is in a framework that we use for doing a lot of the code development that we have at Chess right now. So a lot of your processes can be separated into, you have a reader, a processor, and a writer when you look at your code. And these can kind of be mixed and matched. So this is something that Kira and Rolf have been working on, but basically creating little reusable bases and modular building blocks of the code that we build at Chess. So if, and then we have multiple different types of inputs and user interfaces. So this is to say that even the software that's being built at Chess is now also kind of trying to have a unifying framework for how that is being built so that different processes can reuse pieces of code. So that is the end of my quick overview today on data collection and taking, and just a couple of flavors of things you should be familiar with before you come to the Beamline.